Welcome to Exploring the 18th Century with James Townsend and Son. Today we're starting a series of in-depth episodes related to leavening and specifically chemical leavening. Today I'm joined by Kevin Carter. He's the guy who's usually behind the camera. He does a lot of the research and writing here at James Townsend and Son, and he also constructs the catalog. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about leavening.
Yes. Yeah. I think a great place to start today would be to kind of step back and review the different types of leavening that were used in the 18th century.
Right.
We talked a little bit about this in a previous video that we produced a couple of years ago.
Right.
And I think it might be just a really good kind of jumping off point into our research.
Right.
First of all, there's barm.
Barm.
Yeah.
Which is yeast that you would get, liquid yeast you would get from the brewer.
When you're looking in the 18th century English cookbooks, when they use the word yeast or barm,
Right.
those terms are generally interchangeable. And barm is that foam that develops on the top of a batch of beer as it's brewing.
Right. The kreuzen.
The kreuzen, right. And they would sell it in liquid form, pints.
Right. And that's one of the hints you get in the recipes when they say a pint of yeast. Today we'd say a pint of yeast? What are they talking about? They actually mean barm, liquid yeast. It wasn't very concentrated. The barm is usually the foam or the kreuzen that's off the top of the beer, but there's another kind of yeast.
Right. The French would use the spent yeast off the bottom of the beer, the lees.
Right.
And there's an 1830 reference that talks about how they would actually take that spent yeast, put it in bags, let the beer drain out, and then wash it, and then dry it into cakes.
Right, and that's a 19th century resource. I would probably say that was growing in popularity in the 19th century. In the 18th century, there was more use of old dough techniques.
Oh, yes.
Right.
The leaven.
Right.
Right.
What they would call leaven or old dough.
Right. Where they would take actually a chunk of the dough from the previous batch.
Right.
And they would set it aside.
Right. They'd start off with some kind of a yeast from the brewer.
Right.
The very first batch,
Right.
and then every subsequent batch, they would just use some old dough from yesterday's batch or 2 days ago or whatever, the last time they baked.
Right.
Especially a commercial baker.
Right. And they would take a lump of the dough from the batch of bread.
It'll be a big lump.
Right. And then they would store it either in flour or in salt, and it would keep for quite a while. And now in warmer temperatures, that leaven would oftentimes go sour.
Right.
And then they would need to refresh it with either barm or start over.
You don't see any references to English 18th century wild yeast culture development. People didn't say, oh, you don't have any yeast, just leave this out and it will develop its own. That isn't to say that they didn't do that in other cultures. German sourdough breads, any kind of Northern European rye breads were sourdough.
Even in America, there was a bread called Yankee sour bread.
Likely from other cultural mixes that the people in North America had, that the British, it's like they're in their own little culture and they're going to do what they think is right, and they were not excited about sour breads.
Right.
Blah. They didn't want sour breads.
So anyway, again in review, we have barm. We have leaven. We also have mechanical leavening, which usually involved eggs, or specifically egg whites, where they would sit and whip those things up and until they were infused with air, and then they would gently fold that into a cake batter to preserve the air in that batter. So we had mechanical leavening as well. And then there's this matter of chemical leavening. A matter of great debate as to when that started. Right. And we're going to be looking closer into that.
Dig into that. Here's one little idea. I'm going to throw this at you. I haven't talked to you about this before. When we did the fritters, we added the ale, and it was a modern ale, of course. It's carbonated, and it actually fluffed up the batter.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. There are 18th century or references to using carbonated water in bread to improve, they would say, improve the fermentation.
Right.
But what was happening was that carbonation was releasing the gas.
Right. So you mix it up and it froths right up.
Right.
So
there's even reference of Sarasota Springs in New York, that apparently being a carbonated water source, right. and the bakers in that area produced superior bread.
They also even tried to sort of inject air into dough. They were doing weird things in the late 18th century saying, could we do this? Does this work?
Right. I found one reference to the differences in kneading methods. English bakers apparently would thrust their fists into the dough and then open their fingers to try and get as much air into the dough as they needed it, and moving the bottom dough up to the top and rotating, and they would do that for a long time. People in the 18th century really didn't know what was happening with yeast. Right. There was this concept called fixed air. Okay. Right. Even the earliest mentions of the chemical leavenings by the chemists would talk about how these compounds contained fixed air that would be released by the heat. They believed that the same thing was happening with yeast, that they were little pockets of air.
Compressed air, little nodules of compressed air somehow. Right.
And you see that idea carried over into mechanical leavening, where they're actually injecting air into the eggs, fixing the air in the eggs for it to be released later on during the baking process. It wasn't until 1830, 1840 was discovered that yeast is alive. Right. It's an organism.
It's a plant. It's a thing.
Yeah. Right. It's a mold, and it's actually producing carbolic acid or carbon dioxide as a result. They knew what worked.
Right. Right. Empirically.
Right. And so they came up with all these different processes to make things work.
Right.
And we're going to talk about that in another episode, but how that even applied to the earliest uses of chemical leavening.
So the earliest uses of chemical leavening, is that the next episode?
Yeah, it is. Okay.
The next episode, we're going to be delving deeper into the very kernel, the very beginning of the ideas of chemical leavening. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. You can also check this link out. It'll take you directly to our website, and you can request a print catalog. Thanks so much for watching.